So whether you're shopping for your first or your fifth AK, if you've looked around in the market recently, you've seen there's two different main receiver types. There's going to be the stamped and the milled. They're quite distinctive from each other, both in modding and in practice of how you use them. So today we're going to look at the differences and which one you might want to go with. I'm Cody, welcome back to the channel. For the guns today to represent the stamped and the milled variety, I have an SLR 106 on the table, and then here's my SAM 5 for the milled. I'm going to talk up the stamped a little more than the milled, but just be aware that this milled is still my favorite gun in my entire collection. It's just come back for the gunsmith for some clearancing to fit this Occam chassis, and it's been on the channel since its inception, but it's never been on the channel quite like this. So I'm testing the waters with this today and just function checking, and then we're going to outfit it a little further from here. But before we get too much into the talking, we're going to pop some rounds off on each, and we're going to feel the differences between the two. You can probably tell from the video that the SLR 106 is, despite being a lighter gun, shooting flatter than the SAM 5. But keep in mind, it's braked, it's got a K&S piston, and it's pretty dialed in as of where that has a freshly opened up gas port and a flash hider on it. And I also have less of a cheek weld, so it's just a little punchier overall. Like I said, it's going to get worked on. It's going to get a K&S piston and a suppressor and all that fun stuff. Before we talk about anything else, we have to talk about availability and even getting yourself one of these. The stamp variety here is the Russian standard, and it's what the AK is and was meant to be. So, because it was standardized across all of the Warsaw Pact countries, it's very easy to find, and all the aftermarket stuff and the guns itself is designed around that pattern. This was a stopgap because the Russians couldn't figure out stamping for a while, so it persisted a little bit, but it's much less popular. What that means is on the American market, even if you take companies like PSA or Riley and some of the really low-end stuff out of the equation, this pattern is going to be much easier to find and most likely cheaper depending on the model. There are much fewer options for stamped guns. Arsenal is going to be most of it. There's a few Yugoslav things, and WBP has a small variety of them. And with that being said, if you're going to Arsenal, you're going to pay the Arsenal fee. They'll charge you a little bit more, and generally just because these parts aren't as widespread or available, these guns are going to cost you more even if it comes from, say, WBP. Other than some very slight recoil reduction due to the weight, there's not a whole lot of difference in how these functionally work for you as the shooter. One of the slight differences getting into mods, though, is going to be the side rail. A lot of people say that the side rails that these guns have will flex and won't hold zero. I'm not of that opinion, but if you want to listen to those people and you still want to mount with the side rail, this gun is going to be the one for you because it won't have receiver flex. It's a milled gun. There's a whole lot more material here. There's a whole spare pound of material, in fact. I don't think it matters. Maybe if you have an FRT, it will, but yeah, probably not. When it comes to modding out the stocks on these guns, most likely for the milled gun, you are going to have to remove your tangs. There's an upper and a lower here, and you cut them, and then you can put adapters over it. So if you've got a gun that you don't want to mess with the resale value of, that's not a good idea. On the stamped guns, you have a few different flavors. This one is a 4.5mm folder. There's also 5.5mm and standard fixed AKMs. All three of those are, except for maybe the 5.5mm, which is rare, those are all market standard and parts exist for those pretty easily. The other major modding differences is that the barrel on the milled guns are going to be a slightly different profile. So certain things that require clamping around the barrel, like this chassis itself, will not work gun to gun. Occam fortunately makes one for the milled guns, so I can get it for this, but some things they don't. The gas tube for the milled guns is going to be the same for the upper handguard, and it's going to be the same for the lower handguard and the front retainer, but for the socket in the receiver itself, it's smaller on the milled guns. What that means is that anything like this, you could theoretically file it down to fit into this socket, but it does limit you a little bit because, like, if you have some Zenitco stuff that you can't ever replace if you get rid of because it's not coming in the country ever again, I wouldn't file it down and put it in this gun. I wouldn't do that. So functionally speaking, you might gain some rigidity by going to the milled gun and cutting down some options in the market to do so, but at the same time, the AK was never really known for not being a rigid and reliable rifle in the original stamped configuration. Now, if you were to pick these up side by side, the first thing you're gonna notice is the fact that when you rack the bolts on these, the SAM 5 or any milled gun just feels and sounds a whole lot more premium than the stamped one. On the milled gun, the way that the receiver rails turn into the locking lugs on this basically means it's all one continuous piece because it's all milled out of the same block. So the whole thing seems a little bit smoother. As if we're on the stamped gun, there's a trunnion put into the receiver, so the bolt actually has to ride between the two, and it feels a little more interrupted. Now, as of our 2011s and that kind of thing definitely have a little bit of a smoother recoil impulse because they're smoother like that. These guns I don't believe benefit from that same smoothness. It feels nice to you, you know, manipulating it, but actually shooting it, it doesn't really make a difference as far as I can tell. Now where the smoothness of the receiver on this does come into play is going to be the mag well. Everything in here is just a little bit nicer than on the stamped gun, and reloads on this are just ridiculously easy. When I transitioned from this over to the SLR 106 to train for Masters, one of the biggest differences for me was actually getting the magazines into the mag well. On the SLR, the stamped gun, was slipping the lug and ending up with this a lot in the beginning, because this stamped gun, I'm used to just getting the mags guided in super smooth, and the 106 just wasn't doing that for me. Obviously with some practice it smoothed out, but you know, it was a little rough in the beginning and I definitely noticed it. We've talked about a few of the differences between the two of these in how you have to do more to mod this one. The other thing I want to mention is, again, the weight on the milled guns. You know, I ISBR'd this one, it's tied to me forever and I love it to death, so I'm going to do the work to change it. But that being said, some of the doors, some of the options, I felt like they were closed to me in that I didn't want to add a whole lot of weight like a Zenitco or a Barwaris chassis. They're great items, but at the same time, this gun's already a bit of a brick, and those add a lot of weight. So the milled and stamped guns were set up in the exact same way. I could expect the milled gun to be about a pound heavier straight across the board. The barrel profile is generally a little bit heavier, but most of the weight is going to come from the receiver itself, obviously. And that means that it's not horribly unbalanced because it's all right here rather than way out in the front. But at the same time, you still notice it. Whether you're rucking, whether you're transitioning simply target to target, you feel that extra weight. You know, long days in the summer, it definitely takes its toll. You know, it eats recoil a little bit, but it doesn't do that much for recoil, and the trade-off for it is pretty immense. Hence why this one has been set up in such a way that it's fairly light across the board, and I went for parts that were going to be functional and light, not just raw function. So I had to pick one of these two guns to get rid of and which one to keep. I really don't have an answer for you off the top of my head right now. I've said the SAM 5 here, the milled one is my favorite gun that I own, and the longest one that's been in my collection. But at the same time, this is what the AK was supposed to be. It's lightweight. I've got more mod support should I want to go a different route with how I've got this one set up. It really comes down in the end to your use case. Do you value the aftermarket support that this one has, or you know, the bulletproofness on top of the already bulletproofness of the AK platform? Does that give you the warm and fuzzies? Do you want the 2011 feel where everything's smooth as glass inside, even if it doesn't necessarily do a whole lot for the shooting experience? Also, I mean, what's readily available to you? These guns are going to be easier to come by, not this one specifically, but, you know, a stamped folding AK that's lighter is going to be a lot easier to find than a milled gun. They're out there pretty fairly easily, but you've only got a few choices for milled guns, and it's going to be like the SAM 5s and 7s and maybe older iterations of that. So all that being said, I don't think you could go wrong with either of these. Depending on your use case, one is going to be better for you, and you've got to make that determination, and unless you're like 115 pounds, it could be either one, you know. If you're a small person, maybe the heavier gun's not going to be quite for you. But you know, if you can't use them to their full extent, it doesn't do too much for you either way, so you got to go get out there and train. Pick the one that's going to get you out there to go train more. That might be even more important than either of the specifics, is which one excites you to get on and go out there and use. As always, thank you for watching. I've been Cody. I will see you in the next one. Take it easy.